Commander Zethvar of the Galactic Exploration Corps stood at the observation deck of the orbital station. His four eyes focused on the massive peak that dominated the planet's northern hemisphere. Mount Corvash stretched nearly 40 kilometers into the thin atmosphere of Zirion Prime, its crystalline slopes glittering with deadly beauty under the alien sun. The mountain had claimed 17 expeditions over the past century, each one better equipped and more experienced than the last. "Sir, the human delegation has arrived," announced Lieutenant Crix, her chitinous exoskeleton clicking as she approached. The insectoid officer's mandibles twitched nervously, a sure sign of her discomfort with their newest arrivals. Zethvar's primary eyes remained fixed on the mountain while his secondary pair swiveled to acknowledge his aid. "Show them to Conference Bay 7, and Crix, ensure the environmental controls are set to their specifications. We cannot afford any incidents." The reputation of humans had preceded them across the galaxy. Stories of their reckless bravery, their stubborn refusal to accept defeat, and their alarming tendency to survive situations that should have killed them a dozen times over. Most species viewed them with a mixture of respect and terror. Zethvar had requested their assistance only as a last resort. The conference bay hummed with tension as representatives from 7 different species gathered around the holographic display of Mount Corvash. The humans had taken seats at the far end of the table, and Zethvar couldn't help but notice how young they appeared. The eldest among them couldn't have been more than 30 standard cycles, practically children by galactic standards. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings," Zethvar began, his translator rendering his words into the various languages present. "We have called this meeting because Mount Corvash continues to defy our best efforts. The rare Corvashite crystals at its peak are essential for our new faster-than-light drive systems, but the mountain's unique properties make traditional climbing impossible." Dr. Yelen Korex, the Velkarian physicist, gestured with one of her 6 tentacles toward the display. "The gravitational anomalies alone increase effective weight by 300% above the 15-kilometer mark. The atmospheric pressure drops to near vacuum at 20 kilometers, and the crystalline formations generate electromagnetic fields that disable most technological equipment. Not to mention the temperature fluctuations," added Engineer Morpheus, his rock-like stone mind features remaining impassive. "From minus 40 degrees Celsius to plus 60 within minutes, sometimes multiple times per day." Zethvar watched the humans carefully as each challenge was explained. Where other species showed signs of concern or resignation, the humans leaned forward with what appeared to be interest. The youngest of them, a female with short brown hair, was actually taking notes on a primitive paper tablet. 17 expeditions have failed," Zethvar continued. "The Korthak assault specialists with their powered exoskeletons made it to 18 kilometers before their equipment failed. The Zenthari Cloudwalkers, who can literally fly, were turned back by the electromagnetic storms at 22 kilometers. Even the Grimlock Hivemind, with their distributed consciousness and redundant bodies, lost cohesion at 25 kilometers. Captain Sarah Chen, the leader of the human delegation, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "What's the current weather pattern on the mountain?" The question seemed so mundane that several aliens exchanged glances. Dr. Korex's tentacles writhed in confusion. "Weather? Captain Chen, I believe you misunderstand the scope of the challenge. This isn't a matter of waiting for favorable conditions." Sarah's companion, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, was studying the holographic mountain with intense focus. "Sarah, look at these wind patterns, classic orographic lifting, and those crystal formations. They're creating natural wind channels." The third human, a wiry man named James Wright, had pulled out what appeared to be a primitive measuring device. "Barometric pressure's actually not bad at base level, temperatures within normal range for alpine conditions." Zethvar felt his secondary heart skip a beat. They were talking about the most dangerous mountain in known space, as if it were a weekend hiking destination. "Honored humans," he said carefully, "perhaps we haven't adequately explained the dangers. The Corvash expedition lost 47 beings. The Nexus Scientific Consortium's attempt resulted in complete radio silence after day 3. These weren't amateur adventurers, but the best climbers, scientists, and survival experts from their respective worlds." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of gear were they using?" "State-of-the-art everything," Lieutenant Crix interjected. Powered climbing suits, gravitational compensators, atmospheric processors, quantum communicators, energy shields, matter replicators for food and water. James let out a low whistle. No wonder they failed. The conference bay fell silent. Dr. Corex's tentacles stopped moving entirely. Engineer Morpheus's rock-like face somehow managed to convey shock. Even Zethvar's translator seemed to hesitate before rendering the human's words. "Excuse me," Zethvar said finally. Sarah was examining her notes again. Complex systems fail in complex environments. The more advanced your gear, the more points of failure you create. Murphy's Law. "Whose law?" Crix asked. "Old Earth axiom," Marcus explained. "Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. The more complicated you make something, the more ways it can break." James had moved to the holographic display and was studying the mountain's profile with his hands clasped behind his back. "This is actually a pretty straightforward climb. Class 4 technical sections, some Class 5 rock work near the peak. The real challenges are the environmental factors and the distance." "Straightforward?" Dr. Corex's voice rose to a near shriek. "That mountain has claimed more lives than the Corvan War." "Because everyone's been over-engineering the solution," Sarah said patiently. "Look, you've got teams going up there with so much equipment that they can barely move. Then when the gear fails, which it will in those conditions, they're completely helpless." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Basic mountaineering principle. Travel light, travel fast, be prepared to improvise. You can't technology your way up a mountain." Zethvar found himself leaning forward despite his instinctive unease. "What exactly are you proposing?" James turned from the display with a grin that made several aliens shift uncomfortably in their seats. "We climb it the old-fashioned way. 3 people, basic gear, alpine style, up and down in under a week." "That's impossible," Engineer Morpheus stated flatly. "The logistical requirements alone are exactly why every other expedition has failed," Sarah interrupted. "They've been trying to establish base camps, supply lines, communication networks. All that infrastructure becomes a liability when you're dealing with unpredictable conditions." "But how would you survive without technological support?" Crix demanded. "The atmospheric processors alone weigh 200 kilograms each, and you'd need at least 3 to maintain breathable air at altitude." Marcus reached into his pack and pulled out a small device no larger than his fist. "Portable oxygen concentrator. Battery-powered mechanical action, about as low-tech as you can get while still being effective. Weighs 800 grams. Dr. Corex examined the device with 2 of her tentacles. "This is remarkably primitive. How does it function in low-pressure environments?" "It doesn't," James said cheerfully. "That's why we'll also be carrying bottled oxygen for the final ascent. Old school, proven technology that's been working for centuries." "And for protection against the temperature extremes?" Zethvar asked. Sarah held up what looked like a simple fabric jacket. "Down insulation. Goose feathers, actually. Natural insulation that's been keeping humans warm in extreme conditions for millennia. Light, compressible, effective even when wet." "Goose feathers," Crix repeated in disbelief. "You intend to protect yourselves from deadly cold with bird parts." "Bird parts that work," Marcus confirmed. "We'll layer up for cold conditions, strip down for heat, basic thermoregulation." Engineer Morpheus's rocky features creased into what might have been a frown. "What about the electromagnetic interference? Your primitive equipment will be just as vulnerable as our advanced systems." James produced a coil of rope and a collection of metal devices that looked disturbingly simple. Climbing rope, pitons, carabiners, ice axes, purely mechanical, no electronics to fail. "And navigation?" Dr. Corex asked. Sarah tapped her temple. "Dead reckoning, visual landmarks, basic compass. We've studied the route extensively. The mountain doesn't change, just the conditions around it." Zethvar realized that his mandibles were hanging open and snapped them shut with an audible click. "You're proposing to climb the most dangerous mountain in the galaxy with equipment that my ancestors might have used." "Exactly," Sarah said. "Because your ancestors' equipment couldn't be shut down by an electromagnetic pulse or break when a circuit fried. It either worked or it didn't, and you could fix it with basic tools." The aliens exchanged glances filled with what Zethvar recognized as a mixture of admiration and horror. Dr. Corex was the first to speak. "This is either brilliant or completely insane." With humans, it's often both, James said with another unsettling grin. Marcus had pulled out a detailed paper map and was spreading it across the table. Here's our proposed route. We follow the eastern ridge to avoid the worst of the electromagnetic storms, traverse across the crystal field at 28 kilometers, then straight up the final face to the peak. The crystal field, Crix's voice was barely a whisper. That's where the Grimlock expedition lost half their number. Because they were trying to navigate around the crystals instead of through them, Sarah explained. We go fast and light through the field, no stopping, no complex maneuvering. Get in, get across, get out. Zethvar studied the map, his military training warring with his survival instincts. The weather window for such an attempt would be extremely narrow. 3 days, Marcus agreed. We've been monitoring the meteorological data for weeks. There's a high-pressure system moving in that should give us stable conditions for approximately 72 hours. And if the weather changes, Engineer Morpheus asked. James shrugged. We adapt, humans are pretty good at that. The conference bay fell silent again as each alien contemplated what they were hearing. Dr. Corex's tentacles had begun their nervous writhing again. This approach is so primitive, so risky. All climbing is risky, Sarah said matter-of-factly. The trick is managing acceptable risk versus unacceptable risk. 17 expeditions tried to eliminate risk entirely and ended up creating more of it. Lieutenant Crix's exoskeleton was clicking rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. Commander, surely you're not considering approving this barely planned suicide mission. Zethvar's 4 eyes studied the humans carefully. They showed no signs of fear, doubt, or hesitation. If anything, they seemed eager to attempt something that had killed dozens of beings far more physically capable than themselves. What do you need from us? He asked finally. Transportation to base camp, basic weather monitoring from orbit, and a pickup point for when we come down, Sarah said. We'll handle everything else. When you come down, Dr. Corex repeated, not if. When, Marcus confirmed. Failure isn't really an option. Too many people are counting on those crystals. James was already packing his equipment back into his bag. When do we leave? Zethvar looked around the room at the faces of beings from 7 different worlds, all united in their conviction that they were about to witness either the greatest climbing achievement in galactic history or the most spectacular failure. The transport leaves in 6 hours. That gives you time to make any final preparations. As the humans gathered their primitive equipment and headed for the door, Dr. Corex called after them. Why are you doing this? You could demand almost any price for your services, but you're risking your lives for a standard expedition fee. Sarah paused at the doorway and looked back at the assembled aliens. Because it's there, because someone needs to climb it, and because if we don't, no one ever will. After the humans left, the conference bay remained quiet for several minutes. Finally, Engineer Morpheus spoke in his deep, grinding voice. They're either going to die horribly or make us all look like fools. Probably both, Crix muttered. Zethvar continued to stare at the holographic mountain, thinking about everything the humans had said. Their approach was so fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy. Where others sought to overcome challenges through technology and careful planning, humans seemed to embrace uncertainty and chaos. Sir, Lieutenant Crix prompted, should I begin preparing the memorial documentation? No, Zethvar said slowly. Begin preparing the success protocols, because I have a feeling we're going to need them. 6 hours later, Zethvar stood in the transport bay watching the humans make their final equipment checks. Their gear looked absurdly primitive compared to the sleek, high-tech equipment that had failed on every previous expedition. Rope that appeared to be made of actual fiber, metal tools that showed signs of wear and manual use, clothing that looked like it had been sewn rather than manufactured. Sarah noticed his attention and walked over. Having second thoughts, Commander. I'm having 17th thoughts, he admitted. My military training is screaming at me to call this off. Good, she said, adjusting the straps on her pack. That means you understand the stakes, but Commander, your military training was developed for conventional warfare against conventional enemies. Mountains aren't conventional. Marcus and James had finished their checks and were heading toward the transport. James called back over his shoulder. See you in a week, Commander. Try not to worry too much. As the transport sealed and departed, Zethvar found himself alone in the bay with Dr. Corex, who had come to see them off. Her tentacles were moving in slow, hypnotic patterns that indicated deep thought. "They're completely insane," she said finally. "Yes," Zethvar agreed. "Their plan has more holes than a Zenthari worry web." "Yes. They're going to get themselves killed, attempting something that's been proven impossible." "Probably." Dr. Corex turned to look at him with her large, multifaceted eyes. "So why do I have the feeling they're actually going to succeed?" Zethvar watched the transport disappear into the planet's atmosphere, carrying 3 humans toward a mountain that had already been named their tomb by most of the station's crew. "Because they're humans," he said simply, "and humans don't seem to understand that some things are impossible." The orbital station's main communications array tracked the transport's progress as it descended through Zirian Prime's atmosphere toward the base of Mount Corvash. Long-range sensors showed the massive peak in all its terrifying glory, 40 kilometers of crystalline death reaching toward the stars. In the transport, Sarah Chen checked her equipment one final time while studying the real mountain through the viewport. It was even more impressive in person than in the holographs, a jagged spear of alien crystal and stone that seemed to challenge the very sky itself. "Second thoughts?" Marcus asked, noticing her intense focus. "Just thinking about the descent route," she replied. "The weather window is going to be tight." James was reviewing their planned timeline, making notes on waterproof paper with an actual pencil. Day 1, base camp to 15 kilometers. Day 2, 15 to 30. Day 3, summit attempt and down to 20. Day 4, 20 to base. "Assuming everything goes according to plan," Marcus added. "When does it ever?" Sarah asked with a smile. The transport touched down at the base of Mount Corvash just as the alien sun was setting, painting the crystalline slopes in shades of blue and violet that no human eyes had ever seen before. The pilot, a nervous Valkyrian named Orcs, was eager to complete the drop and return to orbit. "Are you certain you don't want us to establish a forward base?" he asked for the 4th time as the humans unloaded their gear. "We could have supply drops pre-positioned." "We're certain," Sarah said firmly. "The fewer variables, the better." As the transport lifted off and disappeared into the darkening sky, the 3 humans found themselves alone at the base of the most dangerous mountain in known space. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind across crystal formations and the distant rumble of avalanches from the upper slopes. "Well," James said, shouldering his pack, "here we go." They began to climb as the first stars appeared in the alien sky, their headlamps casting small pools of light on the crystalline path ahead. Behind them, the lights of the transport faded to nothing, leaving them truly alone with the mountain and their own determination. High above in orbit, Commander Zethvar stood at his observation post, watching the tiny heat signatures of 3 humans begin their impossible journey. The mountain waited above them, patient and deadly, having already claimed so many lives. But for the first time in decades, Zethvar found himself believing that Mount Corvash might finally have met its match. The first day of climbing began before dawn, with Sarah Chen checking the primitive barometer clipped to her jacket as Marcus Rodriguez melted snow for their morning coffee over a small chemical fuel stove. James Wright was already studying the route ahead, using binoculars that would have been considered antique by galactic standards, but had the advantage of never needing a power source. "Pressure's stable," Sarah announced. "Temperatures -12 Celsius, light winds from the northwest." "Perfect," Marcus said, handing her a steaming cup. "Couldn't ask for better conditions." High above in orbit, Commander Zethvar was receiving the same meteorological data from sophisticated sensors, presented on holographic displays with accuracy to 3 decimal places. The humans were getting essentially the same information from devices that could fit in a pocket and had been in use for centuries. The lower slopes of Mount Corvash were deceptively gentle, a series of crystalline terraces that provided good footing and spectacular views of the alien landscape below. But Sarah knew from studying previous expedition reports that this was where many teams had made their first fatal mistake, loading themselves down with equipment and moving too slowly. "Pace is good," she called to the others as they navigated around a formation of singing crystals that chimed in harmonious tones when the wind passed through them. "We're making better time than projected." James was setting a steady rhythm, his mountaineering experience evident in the way he moved efficiently over the terrain. Unlike the powered exoskeletons used by previous expeditions, the humans were relying on their own muscles and endurance, but this also meant they weren't dependent on equipment that could malfunction. By midday, they had reached the 8-kilometer mark, where the first signs of the mountain's strangeness began to manifest. The gravity fluctuations were subtle at first, just a slight sense of extra weight that made each step require a bit more effort. Sarah checked her mechanical altimeter and noted the reading in her waterproof logbook. "Starting to feel it," Marcus commented as they paused for a brief rest and some food. "Wait until we hit 15 kilometers, James replied, consulting the primitive GPS unit that was their only concession to modern technology. "That's where things get interesting." Above them, the mountain rose in a series of increasingly difficult sections. The crystal formations grew larger and more complex, creating natural obstacles that required careful route finding. Previous expeditions had tried to blast through these barriers or circumvent them with complex equipment. The humans chose a different approach. "Rock climbing," Sarah said simply as they approached a 20-meter vertical section of crystalline wall. "Basic face climbing. James, your lead." James studied the route for a moment, then began selecting equipment from his collection of purely mechanical climbing hardware. Pitons, carabiners, and hexagonal nuts that could be hammered into cracks in the crystal. Each piece was made of simple metal alloys that wouldn't be affected by electromagnetic interference. "On belay," Marcus called, feeding rope through a mechanical device as James began to climb. The alien crystal provided excellent handholds, but it was also razor-sharp in places, requiring careful technique to avoid cuts. James moved methodically up the face, placing protection as he climbed and occasionally pausing to assess the route ahead. "This is actually pretty nice," he called down. "Great friction, solid placements, like climbing granite but prettier." In orbit, the aliens monitoring their progress were incredulous. Dr. Orcs had joined Commander Zethvar at the observation station, her tentacles writhing in patterns that indicated extreme agitation. "They're free climbing a vertical crystal wall," she said in disbelief, "with their bare hands." "The Korthak expedition used explosive charges to create a tunnel through that same section," Lieutenant Crix added. "Took them 6 hours and depleted half their power supplies." "Humans completed it in 40 minutes, Zethvar observed, watching the thermal signatures move steadily upward on his display. By the end of the first day, the humans had established their camp at exactly 15 kilometers, precisely as planned. As they set up their simple fabric tent and prepared dinner over their chemical stove, orbital sensors detected the first significant gravitational anomaly affecting their position. "Weight increase of approximately 40%, Sarah noted, feeling the extra effort required for simple movements. "Still manageable." Their tent was a marvel of primitive engineering, designed to withstand extreme conditions using only fabric, aluminum poles, and mechanical fasteners. No electronics to fail, no complex systems to malfunction. It went up in 10 minutes and provided excellent shelter from the increasingly harsh environment. "Dinner is served," Marcus announced, ladling portions of rehydrated stew into lightweight metal bowls. The food was simple, high-energy fare that had been sustaining human climbers for generations. As they ate, James reviewed their progress against the planned timeline. Day 1 objective achieved. 15 kilometers, good time, no equipment failures, no injuries, weather holding steady. "Long-range forecast?" Sarah asked. Marcus consulted a handheld weather radio, one of their few electronic devices, and selected specifically for its simplicity and reliability. "High-pressure system still tracking on schedule. We should have our 72-hour window." In orbit, the night shift had taken over monitoring duties. Engineer Morpheus had insisted on staying to observe the human expedition, his curiosity overcoming his usual stoic demeanor. The thermal imaging showed 3 small heat signatures clustered around an even smaller heat source from their stove. "Minimal energy expenditure," he noted to the duty officer. "They're using approximately 1% of the power that previous expeditions required for environmental control." "Because they're not trying to create an artificial environment," the duty officer replied. "They're adapting to the existing conditions." The second day began with a weather check that showed slightly deteriorating conditions. Wind speeds were increasing, and cloud formations were building around the upper peaks. But the barometric pressure remained stable, indicating that the high-pressure system was still holding. "We proceed as planned," Sarah decided after consulting with the others. "Conditions are still within acceptable parameters." The terrain between 15 and 20 kilometers was where Mount Corvash began to show its true nature. The gravitational anomalies became stronger and more unpredictable, sometimes doubling their effective weight without warning. The crystalline formations grew larger and more bizarre, creating obstacles that defied conventional climbing techniques. "Electromagnetic activity increasing," Marcus reported, nodding that his simple digital watch had stopped functioning. "Good thing we're not depending on complex electronics." James was navigating a section that the expedition reports had described as impossible without technological assistance. A series of crystal spires created a maze-like passage that required precise route finding and careful movement. Previous teams had tried to map the route using drones and GPS, only to have their equipment fail when they needed it most. "Visual navigation only from here," he called to the others. "Follow my lead and watch your footing." The humans moved through the crystal maze like they were born to it, using intuition and experience to find the best path. When they encountered obstacles, they improvised solutions using their basic equipment and physical capabilities. A gap too wide to jump became a rappel point. A wall too steep to climb became a traverse to a better route. "They're problem-solving in real time," Dr. Korex observed from orbit. "No complex planning, no technological solutions, just adaptation." "Human specialty," Commander Zethvar replied. "I'm beginning to understand why they've survived as long as they have." By midday of the second day, the humans had reached 20 kilometers, entering the zone where atmospheric pressure began to drop significantly. They paused to don their supplemental oxygen equipment, devices so simple they could have been built in a workshop centuries earlier. "Oxygen flow good," Sarah reported, checking her mechanical flow meter. "System functioning normally." The view from 20 kilometers was breathtaking. The curvature of Zirian Prime was visible on the horizon, and the alien landscape stretched out in all directions like a surreal painting. But the humans had little time to appreciate the scenery. The weather was beginning to change. "Wind picking up," Marcus observed, noting how the fabric of his jacket was beginning to flutter more vigorously. "Still within limits, but we need to keep moving." The afternoon brought them to the most technically difficult section of the climb, a near-vertical face of crystal that rose for over 2 kilometers without any obvious rest points. Previous expeditions had used powered ascenders and complex rope systems to tackle this obstacle. The humans chose a more direct approach. "Alpine style," James announced, selecting gear for what climbers called going light and fast. "We'll pitch by pitch, minimal gear, constant movement." Sarah took the lead on the first pitch, her movements flowing smoothly up the crystal face as she placed minimal protection and focused on speed rather than safety margins. Behind her, Marcus and James followed with practiced efficiency, each climber removing the gear placed by the one ahead. "Pitch 1 complete," Sarah called from a small ledge. "Belay up." The crystal face was unlike anything they had encountered on Earth, but the basic principles of rock climbing remained the same. Find handholds, maintain balance, trust the equipment and your partner. It was a dance as old as humanity itself, performed on an alien stage with stakes that couldn't be higher. "This is actually quite beautiful," Marcus commented during a brief rest on a narrow ledge. "The way the light refracts through the crystal formations." "Try to stay focused," Sarah reminded him with a smile. "Beauty can be distracting at altitude." The electromagnetic interference was becoming more pronounced as they climbed higher. James's simple wind-up watch continued to function perfectly, while any electronic device would have failed hours ago. Their basic radio crackled with static, but they could still communicate with each other, and occasionally with the orbital station. "Base, this is climbing team," Sarah spoke into the handheld radio during their evening camp setup at 25 kilometers. "Position confirmed, all team members in good condition, weather holding but deteriorating slowly." In orbit, the communication was received with a mixture of relief and amazement. The humans had now climbed higher than any previous expedition and were still on schedule. "Copy that, climbing team," Lieutenant Crix responded. Weather monitoring shows you still have approximately 36 hours of stable conditions. Understood. Plan to summit tomorrow if conditions permit. The night at 25 kilometers was harsh. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the wind howled constantly through the crystal formations. But the humans' primitive shelter held firm, and their simple sleeping systems kept them warm enough to rest. Sleeping pills, Marcus offered, holding out a small container of medication. Better not, Sarah declined. We need to be alert for any weather changes. James was reviewing their final summit plan by the light of a simple LED headlamp. Assuming we start before dawn, we can reach the crystal field by mid-morning, traverse it during the warmest part of the day, and be on the summit by afternoon. And the descent, Sarah asked. Fast and light down the same route. We should be back at 20 kilometers before dark, then down to 15 the following day. In orbit, the night shift was tracking a weather system that was moving faster than predicted. Engineer Morpheus had remained at his post, studying the meteorological data with growing concern. The high-pressure system is beginning to weaken, he reported to Commander Zethvar. If current trends continue, they may lose their weather window sooner than expected. How much sooner? Perhaps 12 to 18 hours. They'll need to summit tomorrow or not at all. The third day began in pre-dawn darkness with weather that was clearly deteriorating. The wind had increased significantly, and cloud formations were building rapidly around the upper peaks. But the barometric pressure remained stable, giving the humans a narrow window for their summit attempt. It's marginal, Sarah admitted as they prepared their equipment, but still doable. They moved fast from the start, carrying only essential gear and leaving everything else at their camp. The route to the crystal field was treacherous, a series of narrow ridges and exposed traverses that required perfect balance and constant attention. Stay roped up, James called as they approached the crystal field that had stopped every previous expedition. If someone falls into one of those formations, we'll need to get them out quickly. The crystal field was a maze of towering spires and deep crevasses that stretched for nearly a kilometer. The crystals themselves generated powerful electromagnetic fields that created a constant humming sound and made the air shimmer with strange colors. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. No stopping, Sarah reminded them as they began the traverse. Fast and light through the field. The humans moved through the crystal maze with a speed and agility that previous expeditions had never attempted. Where others had tried to carefully map and navigate the safest route, the humans trusted their instincts and kept moving. When they encountered obstacles, they improvised immediate solutions rather than stopping to plan. Crevasse ahead, Marcus called, about 3 meters wide. Jump it, James replied without hesitation. Are you sure? Better than trying to go around. We don't have time for detours. One by one, they leaped across the crevasse, their simple equipment allowing them to move with an agility that powered suits and complex gear had never permitted. It was dangerous, it was primitive, and it worked. Crystal field complete, Sarah announced as they emerged on the far side. Summit pyramid ahead. The final approach to Mount Corvash's peak was a knife-edge ridge of pure crystal that rose at a steep angle for the final 2 kilometers. The wind was now howling at nearly hurricane force, and the electromagnetic interference was so intense that their simple radio had stopped functioning entirely. We're on our own from here, Sarah shouted over the wind. Stay together, watch each other, trust the gear. The final climb was a test of everything the humans had learned about surviving in hostile environments. The crystal was slippery with ice, the wind threatened to blow them off the ridge, and the thin atmosphere made every breath a conscious effort. But they continued climbing with the steady determination that had brought their species across the galaxy. In orbit, the tracking sensors had lost clear resolution due to the electromagnetic interference. Commander Zethvar found himself staring at static-filled displays that gave no clear indication of the human's condition or location. Can we get anything? He demanded of the technicians. Intermittent thermal signatures, one replied. They appear to still be moving upward, but we can't be certain. Dr. Corex had joined him at the observation station, her tentacles moving in rapid, agitated patterns. The weather system is accelerating. They have perhaps 6 hours before conditions become unsurvivable. Then they'll have to summit and begin descent immediately, Zethvar said grimly. On the mountain, the humans were discovering that the final approach was even more challenging than they had anticipated. The crystal ridge was barely wide enough for one person, with 1,000-meter drops on both sides. The wind was so strong that they had to time their movements between gusts, crouching low and moving in brief spurts when the air was calm. Almost there, James shouted, pointing to a crystal formation ahead that marked the summit. 200 meters. Those final 200 meters took them nearly 2 hours to complete. Every step had to be carefully planned and executed. The electromagnetic fields were so intense that the metal in their equipment was beginning to heat up, forcing them to handle their gear with gloves to avoid burns. But finally, impossibly, they stood on the summit of Mount Corvash. The view from the peak was beyond anything they could have imagined. The entire planet spread out below them in alien splendor, while above them the crystalline formations created a natural cathedral that reached toward the stars. The Corvashite crystals they had come to collect were everywhere, formations of incredible beauty that pulsed with their own internal light. "We did it," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "Now we have to get down," Sarah reminded them, already beginning to collect samples of the precious crystals. "Weather's getting worse by the minute." They spent exactly 20 minutes on the summit, just long enough to collect the samples they needed and document their achievement with a simple mechanical camera. Then they began the most dangerous part of any climb, the descent. Going down was always harder than going up, and with the weather deteriorating rapidly, every step was a calculated risk. But the humans moved with the confidence of a species that had been climbing mountains for millennia, trusting their equipment, their skills, and each other. "Base camp by nightfall," James called as they began the long journey down. "We can do this." Behind them, the peak of Mount Corvash disappeared into gathering clouds, its crystal formations still humming with alien energy. The mountain had finally been climbed, conquered not by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by 3 humans with primitive gear and unshakable determination. In orbit, a faint signal broke through the electromagnetic interference. "Base, this is climbing team. Summit achieved, beginning descent. Weather window closing fast, but we're moving." Commander Zethvar felt his secondary heart skip a beat as the implications sank in. "Copy that, climbing team. Congratulations. Descent support standing by." The humans had done the impossible. They had climbed Mount Corvash using nothing but courage, determination, and equipment that most galactic citizens would consider obsolete. And now they had to prove they could survive the mountain's final test, getting back down alive. The weather turned vicious within an hour of leaving the summit. What had been manageable wind conditions became a screaming gale that threatened to tear the humans off the crystalline ridges of Mount Corvash. Sarah Chen led the descent, her movements careful but urgent as she navigated the treacherous knife-edge ridge, while chunks of ice flew past her head like bullets. "Stay low," she shouted back to Marcus and James, though her words were nearly lost in the howling wind. "Time your movements between the gusts." In orbit, Commander Zethvar watched the weather data with growing alarm. The high-pressure system that had given the humans their climbing window was collapsing faster than any meteorological model had predicted, replaced by a massive storm front that was generating wind speeds approaching 200 kilometers per hour. "Sir," Lieutenant Crix reported, her exoskeleton clicking with nervous energy, "the storm system is beyond anything in our historical records. Surface winds are reaching critical velocities." Dr. Corex had been monitoring the electromagnetic interference from the crystal formations, and her readings were equally concerning. "The crystals are resonating with the electrical activity in the storm clouds. The interference is becoming exponentially worse." "Can we get any clear readings on the human's position?" Zethvar demanded. "Intermittent thermal signatures only," the technician replied, adjusting his instruments frantically. "The electromagnetic noise is overwhelming our sensors." On the mountain, the humans were discovering that descent in these conditions was far more dangerous than the ascent had been. The crystalline surfaces that had provided excellent grip when dry were now coated with ice from the sudden temperature drop. Every step required multiple points of contact and constant vigilance. "Rappel point ahead," James called, indicating a solid crystal formation where they could anchor their ropes for a controlled descent. We need to get off this ridge before the wind gets any worse. Sarah reached the anchor point and began setting up their rappel system, using mechanical devices that had been proven reliable in extreme conditions for over a century. Unlike the electronic systems that previous expeditions had relied on, their equipment couldn't be disabled by electromagnetic interference or power failures. "Rope secure," she announced, testing the anchor with her full weight. "Marcus, you're first down." The rappel through the storm was a nightmare of wind-driven ice and limited visibility. Marcus descended into a wall of blowing snow and crystal fragments, following the rope by feel as much as sight. 50 meters below, he found a protected ledge behind a massive crystal formation and signaled the all-clear with 3 sharp tugs on the rope. James followed, his descent complicated by equipment bags that wanted to swing wildly in the wind. Sarah came last, pulling their rope down behind her to avoid leaving any trace of their passage. It was a basic mountaineering principle: take only pictures, leave only footprints. "System moving faster than predicted," Marcus shouted over the wind as they regrouped on the ledge. He had been monitoring his simple weather radio during brief moments when the interference cleared. "We may have less time than we thought." Sarah checked her mechanical watch and compared it to their planned timeline. "We're still on schedule, but we need to keep moving. No extended breaks until we're below the worst of the electromagnetic zone." The traverse across the crystal field that had been merely challenging during their ascent became a desperate race against worsening conditions during the descent. The towering crystal spires that had hummed melodically in the morning wind now shrieked and wailed as the storm winds tore through them. Worse, the electromagnetic interference was causing some of the crystals to discharge energy in brilliant flashes that left temporary blind spots in the human's vision. "Don't look directly at the discharges," Sarah warned as they began moving through the maze. "Keep your eyes on the route ahead." The humans moved through the crystal field like ghosts, their simple equipment allowing them to travel light and fast while the storm raged around them. Where previous expeditions had become bogged down trying to protect complex electronic systems from the interference, the humans simply endured the light show and kept climbing. Halfway through, James reported as they paused in the lee of a massive crystal formation. "Exit in sight." But the storm had one more surprise for them. As they approached the far edge of the crystal field, the electromagnetic discharges suddenly intensified, creating a continuous light show that turned the air around them into a crackling web of energy. The interference was so intense that even their mechanical equipment began to behave strangely. "Compass is spinning," Marcus reported, holding up the simple magnetic device that had been their primary navigation tool. "The electromagnetic field is too strong." Sarah looked around at the crystal formations, trying to remember their route from the ascent. In the blowing snow and flashing lights, everything looked different. For the first time since beginning the climb, she felt a moment of genuine uncertainty. "Dead reckoning from here," she decided. "We go by terrain features and keep the wind at our backs." It was a decision that would have terrified the aliens monitoring from orbit, had they been able to see what was happening. Navigation by instinct in conditions that had overwhelmed sophisticated electronic systems. But for the humans, it was simply another challenge to be met with the tools they had available. James took the lead, using his mountaineering experience to read the subtle signs in the terrain that indicated their correct route. A particular angle of crystal formation here, a distinctive ice pattern there. The kind of navigation that humans had been using to find their way through hostile environments long before they ever dreamed of reaching the stars. "There," he called, pointing through the swirling snow to a distinctive gap between crystal spires. "That's our exit point." They emerged from the crystal field just as the storm reached its peak intensity. The wind was now strong enough to knock them down if they weren't careful, and the temperature had dropped to nearly -50 degrees Celsius. But they were through the most dangerous section and onto terrain they could navigate by sight. 25-kilometer camp in sight," Sarah announced, squinting through the snow at the faint outline of their tent below. "We made it through the field." The tent that had seemed so simple and primitive when they pitched it was proving its worth in the storm. While high-tech shelters from previous expeditions had failed catastrophically in similar conditions, the humans' basic fabric and aluminum structure was bending with the wind rather than fighting it, shedding the snow and ice that accumulated on its surface. "Home sweet home," Marcus said as they reached the shelter and began the process of getting inside without letting the storm in with them. In orbit, the partial clearing of electromagnetic interference allowed the monitoring station to get their first clear reading on the human's position in hours. The relief in Commander Zethvar's voice was evident when he spoke into the communication system. "Climbing team, this is Orbital Base. We have you on sensors at the 25-kilometer camp. Status report." Sarah's voice crackled through the static, but it was strong and clear. "Orbital Base, climbing team. Summit achieved, samples collected, all team members in good condition, taking shelter at 25 kilometers to ride out the worst of the storm. Outstanding work, climbing team. Weather projections show the storm should begin clearing within 12 hours. Descent support will be available when conditions permit." "Copy that. We'll continue descent when it's safe to move." Dr. Orcs had been studying the sensor data with intense fascination. "Commander, their energy expenditure during the descent has been remarkably low. They're not fighting the conditions, they're adapting to them." "Explain," Zethvar requested. "Previous expeditions tried to maintain artificial environments even during emergencies. Powered heating, electronic navigation, active weather protection. When those systems failed, the teams had no fallback options." Engineer Morpheus had joined the conversation, his rock-like features showing what might have been approval. "The humans planned for system failures from the beginning. Their primary equipment is mechanical, their shelter is passive, their navigation is visual. They have no critical dependencies on technology." Lieutenant Crix's exoskeleton was clicking in patterns that indicated deep confusion. "But how do they survive without environmental controls? The conditions are deadly to most known species." "They adapt their physiology instead of their environment," Dr. Korex explained. "Increased metabolic rate for heat generation, controlled breathing for thin atmosphere, manual dexterity maintained even in extreme cold. They're turning themselves into the survival technology." In the tent, the humans were demonstrating exactly what Dr. Korex had described. They had changed into dry clothing, fired up their simple chemical stove for hot food and drinks, and were maintaining body temperature through a combination of insulation, nutrition, and controlled physical activity. "Core temperature normal," Sarah reported as she checked each team member with a basic thermometer. "No signs of hypothermia or altitude sickness. We're in good shape to continue tomorrow." James was reviewing their descent plan while Marcus monitored the weather radio for any changes in conditions. "Storm should clear by morning. We can be at 15 kilometers by midday, base camp by evening." "And the pickup?" Marcus asked. "Transport will be waiting," Sarah confirmed. "Commander Zethvar seems like someone who keeps his word." They slept in shifts that night, with one person always awake to monitor weather conditions and equipment status. It was a precaution that had saved human climbers countless times over the centuries, and it served them well on Mount Corvash. Twice during the night, they had to clear snow accumulation from the tent's ventilation systems, and once James had to go outside to secure a guy line that had worked loose in the wind. Dawn brought clearing skis and dramatically improved conditions. The storm front had passed during the night, leaving behind crystal-clear air and manageable winds. The temperature was still brutally cold at -40 degrees, but after the previous day's conditions, it felt almost tropical. "Perfect weather for descent," Sarah announced as they packed their gear and prepared to break camp. "We should make excellent time today." The descent from 25 kilometers to 15 went smoothly, with the humans moving efficiently down terrain they now knew well. The gravitational anomalies that had made every step difficult during the ascent worked in their favor during the descent, helping them cover ground quickly while maintaining control. "It's actually quite beautiful when you're not fighting for your life," Marcus observed during a brief rest stop, looking back at the crystal formations above them. "Don't get complacent," Sarah warned. "The mountain isn't done with us until we're back at base camp." Her caution proved wise when they encountered their first major obstacle of the day. An avalanche had swept across their planned route during the storm, depositing tons of crystalline debris in a narrow passage they needed to traverse. "Route blocked," James reported after scouting ahead. "We'll need to find an alternative." Previous expeditions might have tried to clear the debris with powered equipment or find a way to go around the obstacle. The humans chose a more direct approach. They improvised a new route over the avalanche debris using their climbing skills and mechanical equipment. "It's just another technical section," Sarah said as she began placing protection for the traverse. "We've done harder climbs than this." The improvised route required 2 hours of careful climbing, but it got them past the obstacle without delay or additional risk. It was exactly the kind of adaptive problem-solving that had made humans successful explorers throughout their history. "Obstacle cleared," Sarah reported to Orbital Base as they regrouped on the far side of the avalanche zone. "Continuing descent to 15-kilometer camp." In orbit, the successful navigation of yet another unexpected challenge was causing serious discussion among the alien observers. Engineer Morpheus had been studying human exploration history and was beginning to understand what made them so effective. "They don't plan for every contingency," he explained to the gathered officers. "They plan to be able to handle any contingency. There's a significant difference." "How so?" Dr. Korix asked. "Traditional galactic exploration doctrine emphasizes comprehensive preparation. Map every route, plan for every obstacle, have technological solutions for every problem. Humans take the opposite approach. They carry general-purpose tools and rely on their ability to improvise solutions as problems arise." Commander Zethvar nodded slowly, "Which means they're never helpless when something unexpected happens." "Exactly. When their environment changes, they change with it. When their equipment fails, they improvise alternatives. When their plan doesn't work, they make a new plan." The afternoon brought the humans back to familiar territory as they descended below 15 kilometers and re-entered the zone of relatively normal gravity and atmosphere. The difference in their movement was immediately apparent as they began covering ground much more quickly. "Feels good to weigh normal again," Marcus commented as they navigated a section that had required careful balance during the ascent. "Don't get overconfident," Sarah cautioned. "Most climbing accidents happen on easy terrain when people let their guard down." Their camp that evening was at the 10-kilometer mark, well ahead of their planned schedule. The weather remained clear, and their equipment was performing flawlessly. For the first time since beginning the climb, they allowed themselves to relax slightly and enjoy their achievement. "We actually did it," James said as they sat around their small stove, sharing a hot meal and watching the alien stars emerge in the clear sky above. "We climbed the unclimbable mountain. And we did it with gear that half the galaxy considers obsolete," Marcus added with satisfaction. Sarah was more cautious in her assessment. "We did it because we planned for what could go wrong instead of planning for everything to go right. Every other expedition failed because they were dependent on systems that couldn't adapt when conditions changed." In orbit, plans were already being made for the humans' return. Commander Zethvar had called a senior staff meeting to discuss the implications of their success. "The humans have proven that Mount Corvash can be climbed," he began. "But more importantly, they've demonstrated an approach to hostile environment exploration that challenges our fundamental assumptions." Dr. Korix's tentacles were moving in slow, thoughtful patterns. "Their methodology could revolutionize how we approach exploration missions. Instead of trying to impose artificial environments on alien worlds, we could learn to adapt to existing conditions." "The humans succeeded because they embraced uncertainty rather than trying to eliminate it," Engineer Morpheus added. "They planned for adaptation rather than control." Lieutenant Crix raised a concern. "But their approach requires biological and psychological capabilities that most species don't possess. The tolerance for risk, the physical adaptability, the ability to improvise under stress." "True," Zethvar acknowledged. "But we can learn from their principles even if we can't exactly replicate their methods. Simpler equipment, more flexible planning, greater emphasis on adaptability over technology." The final day of descent was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the previous days. The humans moved steadily down the lower slopes of Mount Corvash, covering the remaining distance to base camp in excellent time. The weather remained perfect, their equipment continued to function flawlessly, and their physical condition was remarkably good for a team that had just completed the most challenging climb in galactic history. "Base camp in sight," Sarah announced as they approached the landing zone where their transport would meet them. The pickup went smoothly, with the Valkyrian pilot Thorks expressing amazement that all 3 humans were not only alive, but appeared to be in excellent condition. "Remarkable," he said as they loaded their gear into the transport. Previous expeditions. Those who survived required immediate medical attention. You look like you've just returned from a camping trip. Good gear, good planning, good luck, Sarah replied simply. As the transport lifted off from the base of Mount Corvash, the humans took one last look at the massive peak that had defeated 17 previous expeditions. The crystal formations glittered in the alien sunlight, beautiful and deadly, and forever changed by the knowledge that it could be conquered by determination and primitive equipment. So what's next? Marcus asked as they settled in for the flight to orbit. Hot shower, real food, and about 12 hours of sleep, Sarah replied. Then maybe we see what other mountains the galaxy has to offer. James was examining the Corvashite crystal samples they had collected, already thinking about the scientific and technological applications of their success. We might have started something here. Other species are going to want to understand how we did this. In orbit, the humans' return was being treated as a historic event. Commander Zethvar had assembled representatives from multiple species to hear their first-hand account of the climb. The conference bay was packed as Sarah, Marcus, and James presented their simple but revolutionary approach to extreme environment exploration. The key insight, Sarah explained to the assembled aliens, is that complexity creates vulnerability. Every additional system, every technological enhancement, every fail-safe device is also a potential point of failure. In extreme environments, simple equipment maintained by skilled users is more reliable than complex systems operated by computers. Dr. Korex raised the question that was on everyone's mind. But how do we apply this philosophy to species that lack your physical and psychological capabilities? Marcus fielded this one. You don't need to be exactly like humans to benefit from human principles. Focus on adaptability over technology, preparation over prediction, resilience over optimization. Design expeditions that can succeed even when everything goes wrong. Engineer Morpheus had been studying their equipment during the presentation. Your climbing rope is made of synthetic fibers that have been in use for 3 centuries. Your protection devices are simple mechanical systems with no moving parts. Your shelter is fabric and aluminum poles. Yet this equipment outperformed our most advanced systems. Because it's designed for the real world instead of the theoretical world, James explained. Real environments are unpredictable, hostile, and full of variables you can't plan for. Equipment that works in those conditions has to be simple enough to understand, maintain, and repair with basic tools. The implications of the human success would ripple throughout the galaxy for years to come. Mount Corvash, which had stood as a symbol of the limits of exploration, had become proof that those limits existed only in the minds of those who accepted them. But for Sarah, Marcus, and James, the climb was already becoming memory as they focused on the future. The galaxy was full of hostile environments and impossible challenges, and humans had just proven that impossible was simply another word for unexplored. Commander Zethvar found them in the station's observation lounge 3 days later, looking out at the stars with the expression of people who had already moved on from their greatest achievement. "Where will you go next?" he asked. Sarah pointed toward a distant star system visible through the viewport. The Magellan cluster has some interesting exploration challenges, a few planets that have been declared uninhabitable by conventional standards. "You're going to prove them wrong," Zethvar said. It wasn't a question. "We're going to find out what's possible," she corrected. "Humans are good at that." As the humans prepared to leave the station and continue their journey through the galaxy, Mount Corvash stood silent in the distance, its crystal peaks still reaching toward the stars. But now it was no longer a monument to impossibility. It was proof that with enough determination, the right approach, and equipment simple enough to never fail when you needed it most, humans could go anywhere. The galaxy would never be quite the same, and Mount Corvash would never again be considered unclimbable. The 3 cubs had taken their primitive gear up the impossible mountain, and in doing so, they had changed what the universe believed was possible. In the end, that was the most human thing of all.